The advertisement in the newspaper was 12 words long. That was all it took to change a woman's life forever. Wanted, a wife of good health and quiet temperament. No questions. Clara Whitmore read those words in a cold Chicago boarding house in the winter of 1874, her fingers trembling not from the frost creeping under the door but from hunger. She had not eaten a full meal in 3 days. The landlady had posted a notice on her door that morning. Pay by Friday or leave by nightfall. Clara had neither money nor anywhere to go. She was 22 years old and completely alone in the world. Her father had died the previous spring from a fever that swept through the tenements like fire through dry grass. Her mother had passed years before that, leaving behind nothing but a tin locket with a painted portrait so faded you could barely make out the eyes. Clara had worked every job a woman of her station could find. She had sewn buttonholes in a garment factory until her fingers bled. She had washed dishes in a hotel kitchen until her hands cracked and her back curved like an old woman's. None of it was ever enough. The city had a way of grinding people down, of taking everything from those who already had nothing. So Clara answered the advertisement. She wrote her reply carefully, pressing hard on the pen so the ink would not bleed through the thin paper she could barely afford. She described herself honestly. Medium height, brown hair, strong enough to work, willing to do what was needed. She did not write about her fear, or about the way her hands shook as she sealed the envelope. She told herself this was a practical decision, the kind that sensible women made every day. She told herself it was simply a new beginning. 3 weeks later a reply arrived. The man's name was Harold Greer. He lived in the Dakota Territory, on a plot of land he called a ranch but which, as Clara would later discover, was little more than a shack surrounded by frozen mud and broken fences. His letter was short and carried the blunt authority of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. He said he would pay for her train ticket. He said she would arrive by March. He said he expected a hard worker and a woman who knew her place. He did not ask a single thing about her. He did not use the word please once. Clara read the letter 4 times. Then she packed the few things she owned into a single carpet bag and told herself she had no choice. The journey by train took 5 days. She sat in the cheapest car, surrounded by families speaking languages she didn't understand and men who smelled of tobacco and livestock. The landscape outside the window changed slowly at first, the crowded buildings of Chicago giving way to flat farmland, and then to something wilder and emptier than anything she had ever seen. The Dakota Territory in February was a gray and brutal place. The sky sat low and heavy over land that seemed to go on forever, with no trees and no shelter and no color except white and gray and the occasional black smear of a distant ridge. She arrived at a town that was barely a town, just a post office, a saloon and a general store. Harold Greer was waiting beside a wagon. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he has just purchased, checking for flaws, calculating worth. He was older than she had imagined. His face was leathered and his eyes were the color of dirty water. He said nothing when she stepped off the train. He simply turned and climbed onto the wagon seat and waited for her to follow. That night, Clara lay on a straw mattress in a room that smelled of mildew and realized with cold, sinking certainty that she had made a terrible mistake. Harold Greer was not just cold or indifferent. He was something darker than that. He locked the door from the outside when he went to sleep. She heard the bolt slide home in the darkness, and she lay very still, listening to the wind howl across the flat land outside, and she understood that the chains around her life had just grown much, much heavier. Harold Greer did not hit her on the first night. He was smarter than that. He waited a week. In those first 7 days Clara learned the rules of the house. They were not spoken but they were absolute. She rose before dawn to start the fire. She cooked his breakfast in silence. She cleaned everything twice. She did not speak unless spoken to. She did not sit at the table until he had finished eating. She did not look out the windows for too long because Harold did not like it when she looked out the windows. He said it meant she was thinking about leaving. He was right. The land around the property felt like the end of the world. There were no neighbors within 5 miles. The nearest town was 12 miles down a dirt road that turned to mud in spring and ice in winter. Harold had 1 horse and he kept it in the barn and he kept the barn locked. Clara understood without being told that the locked barn was a message. You are not going anywhere. You have no way out. You belong here now. On the 8th day she burned the biscuits. She had been awake since 4 in the morning, her hands raw from the cold water she used to scrub the floors. She had been so tired that she lost track of time at the stove, and the biscuits blackened at the bottom. When Harold sat down to breakfast and saw them, something in his face shifted. It was subtle, just a tightening around the jaw, a narrowing of those dirty water eyes. Then he swept the plate off the table with one arm and told her she was useless. What followed was swift and terrifying and left Clara with a bruise along her left cheekbone that lasted 10 days. Afterward, Harold sat back down at the table, poured himself more coffee, and read his newspaper as though nothing had happened. Clara picked up the broken plate from the floor with shaking hands. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that crying in front of powerful men only invited more cruelty. The weeks that followed were a grinding blur. She cooked, cleaned, mended, and endured. She slept in the locked room. She ate whatever Harold left over. She lost weight she didn't have to spare. She began to mark the passage of time by the bruises, counting them the way prisoners count the marks on a wall. Winter deepened. The temperature outside dropped so far below freezing that the water in the basin beside her bed would ice over by morning. Then Harold came home one evening with a length of chain. He said it was for her own protection. He said she'd been sleepwalking, though she had never sleepwalked a day in her life. He said he couldn't have her wandering out into the cold at night and getting herself killed. He said it with a reasonable tone and a flat expression, and Clara understood that the reasonable tone was the most frightening part. He looped the chain around a post near her mattress and attached a cuff to her wrist. Not so tight it cut off her blood, just tight enough to make movement impossible beyond a few feet. She lay in the dark that first night with the cuff around her wrist and listened to the wind and felt something inside her go very, very quiet. Not peaceful. Quiet in the way a fire goes quiet when it has burned down to the last coal. She was not broken. She would not let herself be broken. But she was nearly out of ways to resist. During the days, Harold would unlock the chain so she could do her work. He watched her constantly, his eyes tracking her around the small house like a hawk watching a field mouse. He began to tell her stories about other women in the territory, women who had tried to run, women who had been brought back, women who had not survived the winter after they left. Clara didn't know if the stories were true. She suspected Harold didn't care whether they were true. The stories were just another kind of chain. Spring began to push against the edges of the cold in small, stubborn ways. The mud returned. A few gray birds appeared outside the window one morning, and Clara watched them with an intensity that made her chest ache. She had not spoken more than 30 words in the last 2 weeks. She was beginning to forget what her own voice sounded like. It was on a morning in early April, when the mud was deep and the sky was the pale yellow of old bone, that she heard something that made Harold go very still at the breakfast table. Hoofbeats. More than one horse. Coming from the direction of the hills to the north. Harold stood up and went to the window. Clara watched his face. For the first time since she had arrived, she saw something move across his expression that she recognized. It was fear. His name was Chaitton. In Lakota the name meant falcon. Clara would learn this later in quieter days. But on that April morning, all she knew was that a man on horseback had arrived outside Harold Greer's door, and Harold Greer was afraid of him. Chaitton was not alone. 3 other men rode with him, all Lakota, all mounted on horses that moved with a confident ease that made Harold's ancient, half-broken mare look pitiful by comparison. Chaitton rode at the front. He was tall in the saddle, lean and broad-shouldered, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a face that was sharp and watchful and entirely unimpressed by Harold Greer's attempt to block the doorway with his body. "Greer," Chaitton said. His English was clean and direct, without apology. "We have business." Harold stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him, but not before Clara pressed herself against the wall beside the window and listened. She could only catch pieces of the conversation. Something about a water source that Harold had been diverting from land that was not his. Something about an agreement that Harold had broken 3 seasons in a row. Chaitton's voice was steady and controlled, but underneath that control was something immovable, like a mountain that has decided to speak. Harold's voice, by contrast, kept rising and then catching itself. He was trying to bluster his way through it. Clara had heard that tone before. It was the tone of a man who knew he was wrong and was covering it with volume. At one point, Clara shifted slightly and knocked a tin cup off the windowsill. It hit the floor with a clatter that sounded enormous in the silence of the house. Harold's voice stopped mid-sentence. A moment later the door opened. Harold looked at her with an expression that promised consequences. But Chaitton looked at her differently. His gaze was sharp and it moved quickly, taking in the bruise that had yellowed at her cheekbone, the thinness of her frame, the way she had pressed herself into the corner, and something in his face changed. Not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man. But his eyes settled on her with a kind of focused attention that felt different from every other way any man had ever looked at her. "Is this your wife?" he asked Harold, still looking at Clara. "That's my business," Harold said. Chaitton did not look away from Clara. "Are you well?" he asked her directly. No one had asked her that question in months. The simplicity of it nearly undid her. She opened her mouth and said, "No," before she could stop herself. The word came out small and raw, barely a whisper, but Chaitton heard it. Harold moved toward her then, a fast, threatening movement, and one of Chaitton's companions made a sound low in his throat, and Harold stopped. The air in the room was stretched tight as wire. "I want to speak with your wife," Chaitton said to Harold. The phrasing was polite but the intention was granite. What followed was a negotiation Clara was not fully part of but which changed everything. She would only understand the full shape of it later. What she understood in the moment was that Chaitton stayed. He came back the next morning. And the morning after that. He came on the pretext of the water dispute, which was real and ongoing, but he always found a way to speak a few words to Clara, always when Harold was within earshot, always carefully. He was not reckless. He was methodical. He was building something with patience and precision, the way a man builds a structure that has to withstand a great deal of weight. On his fourth visit, Harold was called to the south field to deal with a fence that had collapsed in the mud. He would be gone for at least an hour. Chaitton appeared at the door 7 minutes later. He looked at the chain on the post beside Clara's mattress for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at her. "How long?" he asked. "Since February," she said. He nodded slowly. His jaw was tight. He looked around the room with an attention that missed nothing. Then he said, "I'm going to help you leave. But I need you to trust me. And I need you to be patient for a little longer. Can you do that?" Clara looked at this man who had ridden out of the frozen hills like something the land itself had sent. She thought about the locked door and the bruises and the chain and the endless gray weight of the last months. She thought about the bird she had watched out the window, the gray one, the one that came back every morning and sat on the fence post as though it was waiting for something. "Yes," she said. "I can do that." Trust is a fragile thing when every day has taught you that it breaks. Clara held on to Chaitton's promise the way you hold a flame cupped in your hands in the wind, constantly aware of how easily it could go out. She had believed in things before and been wrong. She had trusted the words in a newspaper advertisement and ended up chained to a post. She knew better by now than to let hope run ahead of her. But she also had nothing left to lose. The days that followed were agonizing in their slowness. Harold seemed to grow more suspicious, more watchful. He took to sitting in the main room of the house in the evenings rather than going to bed early, which he had done before. He watched Clara with the particular intensity of a man who senses something changing but cannot name it. She was careful. She moved through her chores the same way she always had, head down, hands busy, no eye contact. She had become very good at making herself small. Chaitton came back 3 more times over the course of 2 weeks, each time with a legitimate reason that Harold could not argue with. The water dispute gave him ongoing access to the property. The territory's rules about shared water sources were clear, and Harold, who had never been on the right side of the law in this matter, couldn't afford to turn Chaitton away entirely. He was too afraid of what Chaitton represented. Not just himself but the broader network of Lakota families in the region, their knowledge of the land, their relationships with certain territorial officials who understood that peaceful cooperation was essential to survival in a place as unforgiving as Dakota. During those visits, Chaitton found ways to pass small things to Clara. A piece of paper tucked under the edge of a water barrel with a rough map drawn on it. A small knife, folded, slipped into the pocket of her apron during a moment when Harold's back was turned. A signal, a single low whistle that would mean it was time. Clara memorized the map. She kept the knife hidden in a crack in the floorboard under her mattress. She rehearsed the route in her mind every night before she slept, lying in the dark with the chain at her wrist, tracing roads and landmarks behind her closed eyes. North along the creek bed. Through the stand of cottonwood trees. Up to the ridge. Follow the ridge east until you see the 3 flat rocks. Wait there. She did not know what would happen after the 3 flat rocks. She chose to trust that something would. The night it happened was a Thursday in late April. Harold had been drinking, which he did occasionally but not frequently, and when he drank he fell asleep faster and harder than usual. Clara lay still and listened to his breathing through the thin wall for 2 full hours after the house went dark. When she was certain, she reached under the mattress for the knife. She used it to work at the lock on the cuff around her wrist. She had been practicing this for 4 nights, using the thin edge of the blade to explore the mechanism, learning it by touch in the dark. On the 4th night she had got it open in under 3 minutes. Tonight she did it in 2. She left the chain on the post. She put on every layer of clothing she owned. She took the tin locket from around her neck and held it for a moment in her palm, feeling the warmth of it. Then she tucked it back under her collar and moved to the door. Harold had started locking the door again from the inside in recent weeks, using a sliding bolt that he thought she couldn't reach. He was wrong by 3 inches. She had discovered this by accident 2 days earlier and had spent those 2 days controlling every expression on her face so he wouldn't see that she knew. She slid the bolt. She opened the door. The cold hit her like a wall. She ran. The land was dark and the mud pulled at her boots with every step. The creek bed was exactly where the map had said it would be. The cottonwoods were ghostly in the moonlight, pale and skeletal, but she found them. She climbed the ridge on her hands and knees in places where the mud made standing impossible. Her lungs burned. Her legs shook. She found the 3 flat rocks just before dawn, gray shapes emerging slowly from the darkness. She crouched behind them and wrapped her arms around herself and waited. The whistle came 15 minutes later. Low and clean on the cold morning air. And then Chaitton was there, on horseback, with a second horse beside him, and he looked at her with those steady, watchful eyes and said simply, "You made it." Clara stood up on legs that were barely holding her. "I made it," she said. Freedom, it turned out, was not simple. Clara had imagined that escape would feel like dropping a weight that had been crushing her for months. And in some ways it did. The morning she rode away from Harold Greer's land on a horse that moved easily beneath her, with the cold April wind pulling at her hair and the sky opening up ahead in every direction, something inside her chest expanded in a way that was almost painful, like blood returning to a limb that has been numbed too long. But freedom was also terrifying. She had no money. She had no destination. She was a woman alone in a territory where women alone were either pitted or preyed upon, and sometimes both. Chaitton seemed to understand this without being told. He did not take her back to the nearest town and hand her over to the care of strangers, which would have been the simplest solution and, Clara would later think, the one most men would have chosen. Instead he took her north. He took her to his people. The Lakota village was set among a curve of hills that broke the worst of the wind, near a river that moved black and quick between snow-edged banks. It was larger than Clara had expected. There were children running between the lodges, and the sound of voices and the smell of wood smoke and cooking meat, and dogs that watched her with calm curiosity. People looked at her, this thin white woman on a borrowed horse, with expressions that ranged from wariness to open interest to something that might have been compassion. An older woman named Winona, who Clara would later learn was Chaitton's aunt, came out to meet them. She looked at Clara for a long moment, taking in the yellow bruise, the hollow cheeks, the way Clara held herself, slightly turned, the reflex of a person accustomed to flinching. Winona said something in Lakota that Clara did not understand. Chaitton translated. "She says you look like someone who has been fighting for a long time." Clara said that was true. Winona nodded as though this was exactly what she had expected, and took Clara by the hand and led her inside. In the weeks that followed, Clara learned what it meant to be seen by people who had no interest in owning her. It was not easy. The adjustment went both ways. Clara had arrived with a foreigner's ignorance and a wounded person's wariness, and there were moments of miscommunication and friction and awkward silence. But the women of the village were patient with her and often funny, and Clara, who had almost forgotten how to laugh, found herself laughing more than she had in years. She learned to make herself useful, which was the one thing she had always known how to do. She learned a handful of Lakota words. She helped where she could. She accepted help when she needed it, which was harder. Chaitton was not her rescuer in the way of stories, sweeping in to carry her off to a new life. He was something quieter and more useful than that. He was a man who had seen something wrong and refused to look away from it. He had acted with patience and precision rather than drama. He had given her the tools and the chance and trusted her to do the rest herself. That distinction mattered enormously to Clara. She had been treated as an object for long enough to recognize and deeply value the difference between being saved and being given the means to save yourself. Harold Greer came looking for her once. He arrived at the edge of the hills with 2 other men and a self-righteous fury that Clara could see from a distance. The conversation between Harold and Chaitton that day was brief. Clara did not hear all of it. What she understood was that Chaitton spoke to Harold in the same measured, immovable tone he had used from the beginning, and that Harold left with nothing, because there was nothing Chaitton was willing to give him. The territorial law was complicated and inconsistent, but Chaitton knew it thoroughly, and Harold Greer, who had never been careful about the lines he crossed, had given him more than enough leverage to work with. Clara watched Harold ride away until he was a small, dark shape disappearing into the flat gray distance, and then he was gone. She stayed through the summer. She helped bring in food stores for winter. She sat with Winona in the evenings and learned the older woman's stories, offered her own in return. She wrote letters to no one because there was no one to write to, and then one day she started writing simply to write, setting down what had happened to her in plain, careful language, as if the act of recording it was a way of making it real and then making it over. In the autumn, she made a decision about what came next. It was her own decision, made with a clear head and an open road in front of her, and the simple, profound fact of that was enough to make her sit very still for a moment and feel the weight of it. Choice. After so long without it, choice felt like stepping into sunlight after a long time underground. Chaitton asked her once near the end of summer if she was all right. The same question he had asked on that first morning in Harold Greer's house, when no one else had thought to ask it. She thought about everything that had happened. The advertisement. The train. The locked door. The chain. The dark run across frozen mud. The 3 flat rocks and the whistle at dawn. The village and the laughter and the slow, difficult, necessary work of becoming someone who was not afraid. Yes, she said. And this time she meant it entirely.